Okay. Okay. So, if I am correct, last week we didn't have a lesson, but the week beforehand, we discussed the Orientalist aspect of Rabbi or Chacham Yitzchak Bernays, right? And we discussed the questions of how things evolved, I would say, as Bernays' response to the reformists as a form of a debate between two modernist movements. That is, a reform movement was most definitely a modern movement that went or was an involvement of trends that were both in the Christian world and in the general population, and consequences of the emancipation and, of course, of assimilation of many Jews in Germany. By the way, these generations between the 18th and 19th century, the amount of assimilation in Germany was astonishing. Some people talk about 60 or 70% of the Jewish population in Germany that assimilated. So the reformists believe that they have a solution to this problem, and the solution is to allow Jews to have the same status they have now after the emancipation in the general public, but to have something similar within the Jewish community in a sense that will allow them the trends and the spirit of modernity to be part of their communal worship. And many of them perceived halacha as something archaic, something of the past, as an attempt to mimic worshiping God the way he was worshipped 2,000 years ago. Hence, we need to have architectural changes. We need to have changes in our liturgy. We need to have changes in our daily worship, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Orthodox movement, it wasn't called yet Orthodox. This is important. They too believed, at least the vast majority of them, understood that they have to uh, uh, contain modernity within the framework of the communal worship that they already have. They need to adapt to modernity, hence the Orientalist aspect of Chacham Tzvi and Chacham Yitzchak Bernays, hence the understanding that it isn't that problematic to acquire a higher education, to be part of the German community, the German population, and indeed to have some changes in the communal structure and hierarchies and so on and so forth, and to allow more aspects of, and I haven't spoken about this in length yet, of Wissenschaft des Judentums, that is the scientific perspective on Judaism, to allow some of it to penetrate and to be part of various aspects of Jewish worship. And this is where uh, there is still a debate even today between scholars regarding the question if Wissenschaft des Judentums as a movement, that is the movement calling for the scientific learning and scrutiny of Judaism, should be considered a critical scientific perspective on Judaism, or conversely, may also be considered as a part of a religious form of practicing Judaism. That is, uh, the modern way of practicing Judaism is by perceiving it in a skeptical and a more critical perspective, and hence to allow some ancient ideas and ancient forms of worship to revitalize them on the one hand, and on the other hand, to allow some not so ancient forms of worship to be omitted from the books and from the practices. For instance, the way Jews dress, the way Jews speak, the way some hierarchies became almost sacred within Jewish communities, many of them do not have any source in rabbinic literature, and of course not in the biblical literature. However, when you look into the biblical way of life, you see that many of the halachic constraints that are now part of what rabbinic Judaism looks like did not exist there. When it comes to gender aspects, when it comes to, I'm not talking about gender identity, I'm talking about the relationship between the genders. Okay, yeah. And Jordan, you don't have to tell anyone that I'm talking about two genders. Okay, I know in Canada it's problematic, so I'm just claiming this is just for the sake of the argument, and I'm not claiming any. I'm not endorsing any form of gender perspective. Just to be clear, of course I am, by the way, but never mind. And you can see that the tefillah, the liturgy in the Bible, is not as strict and is not as it's not as formal as it is in modern times, and so on and so forth. So, in essence, many in the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement felt at home within the Reform movement by creating this renaissance of what Judaism used to look like in their perspective. By the way, completely imaginary, but never mind. Everyone is imagining how Judaism looked like 2,000 years ago. No sector has anything to do with how Judaism looked like 2,000 years ago, but everyone claims that they are more loyal to the traditional forms of Judaism. Of course, everyone has invented and has accepted and integrated several reforms and several new traditions, which is an oxymoron, within their forms of religious worship. But this idea of Wissenschaft des Judentums became very profound within many in the Reform circles. However, it was not alien to Orthodox circles as well. A good friend of mine, Professor Asaf Yedidia, wrote a very important book on how the Orthodox movement invented its own Wissenschaft des Judentums, and how many of its great leaders were, in fact, scholarly and academic leaders in their fields, even though many of them did not have academic positions, but they did contribute, nevertheless, a lot to how we understand nowadays historical aspects of Judaism. But as opposed to their peers within the Reform movement, they believed that this is a revitalization of halakha. That is, it could contribute and enrich our halachic perspectives and not destroy them like many within the Reform circles attempted. Now, I don't want to be superficial, but it is and it should be presented that almost from day one, within the circles of Reform rabbis, many of the most important and essential, or I'm not sure that's a good word, many of the core elements of halachic jury in our days have been completely not only neglected, but in fact completely erased from the cultural landscape of the Reform movement. For example, and this is, well, this isn't from day one, but it was in the mid-19th century, one of the first congregations of Reform rabbis, conferences of Reform rabbis in Germany, served seafood. It wasn't kosher. And this is within rabbinic circles, let alone the observance of Shabbat and so on and so forth. So while the complaints about the archaic aspect of the classical, or at that point already Orthodox rabbinic circles were indeed part of the rhetoric of the Reform movement, yet within some circles, and very prominent, I must say, there was a complete abandonment of how halacha should in fact be a governing authority of Jewish life. Now, this is where it became quite clear that the clash between Reform and Orthodox circles, or I would even say the schism between these circles, is not something of a political dispute. It is a very profound, deep, and fundamental discussion. The debates here are much more are very deep, and not this is not an attempt to let's say to this is not a cosmetic discussion on how Judaism should look like. This is a real discussion which actually touches the core elements of Jewish life. That is, at a very early point, it was crystal clear that at least the most right wing, I would say, circles of the Reform movement do not accept the mere idea of any halachic authority that has anything to do with the common known laws of halacha as are known in modern times. They abandoned this idea completely. And it was an attempt to recreate a whole new language and a whole new worldview, but also questions of moral guidance were completely different than how they looked like in Orthodox circles. So when we look at Geiger was perhaps the most important Reform leader at the time in the mid-19th century. When we look at his versions of the Siddur, of the Jewish liturgy book, we see how elemental these discussions became, as not only did he find it fit to rewrite whole chapters and whole parts of the prayer in light of what he and others considered the core new values of Judaism, but also it wasn't only a discussion about values, because this discussion had significant implications on the idea of redemption, the messianic idea within the Jewish communities and the Jewish people, questions of territorial aspirations and national aspirations in general. That is, at a very early point, it was quite clear that within the Reform movement circles, the whole idea of achieving a new national form of sovereign country the whole idea was now considered by numerous people within the Reform movement as heresy. Now, I know it's kind of funny to speak about heresy within a group that in fact challenges all rabbinic authority, and in fact claims that being a modern Jew is in fact being a critical Jew that is not compliant with how Jewish circles and classical Jewish communities lived their life and held beliefs. So how can you call them heretics, or how can you not them? How can you think that they would consider anyone discussing questions of redemption and messianic perspectives as a heretic when they themselves were not they weren't interested in any idea that had anything to do with authority and hierarchy, at least when it comes to religious questions. Well, I know, but still, it became very non-popular to a point that it was considered even a non-Jewish perspective if you are talking about a reform interpretation of Judaism. Now, my good friend, Professor George Yaakov Kohler, he also teaches at our department. And maybe did any of you take his courses, Professor Kohler? No? Okay, so he is delivering a course nowadays as we speak, discussing messianic perspectives within the Reform movement. So just let me be clear. It's not that the Reform movement did not have any redemptive perspectives and did not strive, at least some of its members, to a messianic world. Some of them did, but generally speaking, these ideas came in the late 19th and early 20th century, not in the first 100 years or first 80 years of the Reform movement. Within those years, the Messianic idea wasn't as prominent, and it would be quite safe to say that, in fact, it was kind of neglected. Also, many core ideas such as the Shabbat, of course, I mentioned kashrut, and also questions of family purity when it comes to the laws of purity. Okay, I'm not talking about racial aspects. I'm talking about the laws of purity, nidah, and mikveh. They were kind of the first to go. Now, it's quite understandable because, and I'll try to be politically correct here as much as I can, but we must understand that we're talking about people living 150 or 170 years ago. The idea of Ostjuden, the Jews from the East, in many instances came with some very harsh stereotypes, some of which could be considered nowadays as almost anti-Semitic. So the idea of Jewish hygiene and purity in the form of the mikveh, as those Ostjuden talked about, wasn't accepted fairly in Reform circles. In fact, it was also considered as a relic, and I'm not talking about a cute and nice relic that you put on your in your living room. I'm talking about a fossil of a completely archaic ancient religion that has nothing to do with how we perceive hygiene and purity and cleansing nowadays. So if anyone wants to be clean, they should go to the bathroom and get a good shower with plenty of soap and not immerse oneself in the mikveh. Moreover, we must remember that within the Reform movement, many considered the threat of assimilation as a very big problem. That is to say, the reform movement in its historical evolvement was an attempt, and this is quite clear, an attempt to stop assimilation and to halt its enormous implications on the Jewish community, but stopping assimilation on the one hand and asking for Jewish women and Jewish families to adhere to what they considered as very archaic laws of hygiene, that doesn't go well together because people who want to assimilate want to live a modern life and they don't want their Jewish background and their Jewish roots to become a burden. They want to live their Jewish life as modern people without being interrupted too much. Needless to say that observing the laws of family purity take their toll. I mean, still today, I mean, it's not easy as a rabbi with almost 2 decades of practice, of experience in the rabbinical circle. I can tell you that these questions and these laws of purity, while hundreds of thousands adhere to them, nowadays even millions, I would say in Israel, adhere to these laws, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're fun. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't come with complications. They do. Sometimes it isn't that easy. Sometimes people don't necessarily enjoy the idea of adhering to these laws. However, they still continue to do so because they believe it's their religious obligation. So what happens is that you have the reform within the reform movement, you have some growing circles of people who have a critical, even skeptical perspective on their Jewish heritage. You have a reframing and reforming, literally, reforming of the Jewish liturgy. And of course, when you change prayers and liturgy, you also change the ideology that comes behind them. And what we also have is an abandonment of some of the core halachic pillars of Jewish communities, historically speaking, led by no less than the religious leaders of the Reform movement. Needless to say that this did not go as it wasn't easy for Orthodox circles to accept this. And we do see a lot of harsh rhetoric against reform leaders and against reform communities. At this point, I want to stop discussing Germany and I want to focus our attention on what's going on in Hungary. Now, this will be crucial specifically at this point because, as you'll see, while the German model of the birth of the Orthodox movement sounds like something that came out of a dispute, of a quarrel between two sections, it isn't even close to what happened in Hungary. Now, as a Hungarian Jew, that is, I mean, I'm a descendant of Hungarian Jews, I can tell you that, well, I don't know, is anyone here from Hungarian origins? Okay, so Hungarians tend to be temperamental. How's that for fiery and feisty people? I mean, did I speak politely? Hungarians tend to take their battles very seriously. It's a very important part of their lifestyle. They're warm-blooded, okay? So everything that happens in Hungary usually tends to become much more dramatic and vocal. Yet, when it comes to the debates between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox circles in Hungary, things get very fast out of hand. Before we continue, let's hear a song. Any recommendations? Anyone? Anyone? I know. We'll hear a song that, despite its very non-Jewish text, was in fact created, of course, by a Jew. And it's actually very relevant to the date. Just a moment. Let's hope the internet, the gods of the internet, aid us in our mission. But why would they? Oh, here we go. Just a moment. Come on. One of the most recorded songs in music history was, of course, created by a Jew.
למה להצטרף לדיסקונט? יש לי ארנק שמלא בסיבות.
מצטרפים לדיסקונט ונהנים מחבילת הצטרפות מנצחת וגם מהארנק הירוק שמשתתף איתכם באלפי שקלים ברכישות הגדולות. דיסקונט, רוצים אותך יותר.
Oh, come on. Oh.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, where the treetops glisten and children listen to hear sleigh bells in the snow. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, with every Christmas card I write. May your days be merry and bright, and may all your Christmases be white. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, where the treetops glisten,
Where the treetops glisten
and children listen
and children listen
to hear
sleigh bells in
the snow.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, with every Christmas card I write.
May your days be merry
and bright,
Irving Berlin, or as his original name is, Israel Isser Beilin, wrote this song, both the lyrics and the melody. He is considered one of the most famous songwriters of American history, and specifically of Hollywood and Broadway. By the way, he owned part of Broadway, and he was an immigrant from Russia, a Jewish immigrant from Russia. His family escaped the pogroms in the end of the 19th century, and he wrote White Christmas. By the way, he was a Jew, and he didn't convert. He continued to be a Jew. He only changed his name, as many do. But it goes to show you, I mean, so yeah. Okay. When we discuss the Hungarian story of Orthodoxy, we have to start with one very important figure considered by many as the most important individual that has anything to do with Hungarian Orthodoxy, and even, in many accounts, to Orthodoxy at large. And that would be Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, or as he is commonly known, the Khatam Sofer. He's called Khatam Sofer after his book. I'll just show you. We have a painting of him. It's not a picture, but a painting. Just a moment. There we go. Okay. By Moshe Sofer Schreiber, as you'll see, Schreiber was his original name. Moses Schreiber, known to his community and Jewish posterity in the Hebrew translation as Moshe Sofer, was an Austro-Hungarian rabbi, one of the leading Orthodox rabbis of Hungary during the first half of the 19th century, and that's an understatement, because he was much more than that. A teacher to thousands and a powerful opponent of the Reform movement in Judaism, which was attracting many Jews in the Austrian Empire and beyond. As Rav of the city of Pressburg, now Bratislava, he advocated for strong communal life, first-class education, and uncompromising opposition to reform and radical change. Now, this is where things become very tricky. First of all, in Hungary, where Rabbi Sofer, despite the fact that he came from German origin, he was born in Frankfurt. In Hungary, there were no Reformed Jews up until the Second World War. So the Reform movement never came to Hungary. There were a few in Austria, but in Hungary, essentially no Reformed Jews. Yet, there was another section of Judaism called Neolog Jews, but they were very different from Reformed Jews. Nowadays, even today, and by the way, it happens even within academic circles. Many people don't know the difference between Reform and Neolog Jews, and thus they come to very wild and very inaccurate conclusions when it comes to describing the unique characteristics of each of these groups. We'll start with a historical description. First of all, the Neolog movement came to be as something of a movement even before Rabbi Sofer's passing away. Now, if you saw, he passed away in 1839, so we're talking about approximately the same dates, the same years as the Reform movement, the beginning of the 19th century. Yet, as opposed to the Reform movement, the Neolog movement, at least in its initial stages, was led by rabbis that did, in fact, adhere strictly to the halakha. Because as I said beforehand, within the reform movement, even in the early celebrations and conferences of rabbinic leaders of the reform movement, you had non-kosher food, and you had people not observing the Shabbat and other very fundamental laws. This never happened in the Neolog movement. The first debate between Neologs and Orthodox rabbis, before they even were known as Neolog or Orthodox, the first debate was a purely halachic debate that questioned the kosher characteristics of a fish. That is, a sort of a fish that tended to shed its scales once it was taken out of the water. Okay? Because according to the kashrut laws, in order for a fish to be considered kosher, it has to have scales. It also has to have fins, but when we look at the biological questions, all fish who have scales have already fins. So, in fact, the necessity of fins isn't that clear. I mean, they have to have fins, but all fish who already have scales have fins, as opposed to not all fish who have fins have scales. Take, for example, sharks. Okay, sharks have fins, of course, but they don't have scales. So the question was, is a fish that has scales when it is immersed in the water, but sheds them the moment or a few moments after it is taken out of the water, should it be considered kosher or not? Now, we must be very careful here because the different rabbinic figures who took part in this discussion, many of them were Orthodox. That is, many of the rabbis who thought that this kind of fish should be considered kosher were strictly mainstream rabbis who had nothing to do with any sort, way, shape, or form of any reform perspectives when it comes to the authority of halakha. That was a strictly pure halachic discussion. Do fish have to have scales even when they are outside of the water or not? That's a halachic debate. However, one of the rabbis who took part in this discussion was Rabbi Aharon Chori. I'll just show you his name in a moment. Here you go. Why isn't this working? Well, just a moment. The internet is just beautiful today. So cooperative. Come on. I don't get it. It's working in some area. Oh, here we go. There we go. I'll show it to you. Okay, Rabbi Aaron Chorin, as you can see, passed away 5 years after the Chatam Sofer, after Rabbi Moshe Schreiber. Now, in the early years, you can see he was a standard rabbi in Arad. There we go. Arad, nowadays it's called Oradia. And he actually was rabbi there for approximately 50 years, even more. Now, he published his first pamphlet, Imrei Noam, in which he argued that as a sturgeon had scales, it was permitted as food according to scripture. His opinion, although following that of Landau and other authorities, Landau here is Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, chief rabbi of Prague, and you can see him here, and considered by many as the most prominent rabbinic leader of Europe at the time. Now, he was strongly opposed by Rabbi Mordechai Bennett and his partisans. Rabbi Yitzchak Krishhaber of Paksh wrote a refutation, Makel Noam, which he opposed, of course. Now, actually, at this point, things really got out of hand. And you can see now he published at 1803 a book called Emek HaShaveh, divided into 3 parts. And there he became critical to how halacha is perceived in wide circles, and he came to really some very interesting conclusions, by the way, many of which today would still be considered as strictly Orthodox. But his debates, and this is the most important part, we must understand this, his debates were not exterior debates. He did not try to contest the halacha and to challenge it from the outside. He did not claim that the halacha in its essence is an archaic idea. He did not think that Jews should reconsider the halacha as something that is mandatory. On the contrary, he was keen to have halachic discussions. He did think, however, that one should not be tangled by the fact that someone once said something that might have some consequences on reality today, and he thought that we should hold a more, nowadays we would call it positivist perspective of reality. That is, we have the autonomy, the halachic autonomy, to reinterpret some of the ideas in the Torah, in the scriptures, and in the Talmud, according to the changing realities of our generation. That is, I'll give you an example. If in the past, for example, a lot of the laws concerning questions of kashrut were part of a discussion that tried to prevent Jews from befriending their pagan neighbors, because there was a sincere fear that the Jews will learn and eventually imitate pagan behavior, which they will learn from their neighbors. However, nowadays, Europe has no pagan societies. No one in Europe in the 19th century is pagan. Everyone, all of them are Christians. Now, if we still want to have a productive relationship with our hosts here at Europe, and if we want to be part of the Hungarian society or the Austrian society, we must understand that the implications of how we treat our neighbors could be dire. And since there is no real threat that we will become pagans due to our proximity to our neighbors, well, then many of the laws that are mentioned in the Talmud as intended to divide between monotheists and non-monotheists and idolatry believers, many of those laws are in fact irrelevant today. Now, this is purely a halachic form of thought. That is, Chorin accepts the idea that there is a divine God expects us, his people, to listen and to adhere to the laws, the commandments that are delivered in the Torah. Moreover, there is an acceptance of the idea that the Torah is in fact a gift from God to humanity and specifically to the Jewish people. So many of the core ideas that create halachic hierarchy as we know it are in fact non-contestable by Rabbi Aaron Chorin. But he does think that we need to have more autonomy when we go to discuss our halachic reasoning, in our halachic argumentation. We don't need to be tied, to be bonded to anachronistic interpretations of the law when we actually should use our common sense and understand when halachic decisions and when halachic proclamations are a result of a specific historical circumstances and not something that was directly delivered from God. So, when it comes to questions of language, for example, okay, why were several prayers composed in Aramaic? Okay, we know Jewish liturgy. Okay, it has parts that are in Aramaic. Why were they composed in Aramaic? One could claim that they were composed in Aramaic because, and I'm saying this because it's written, because the divine angels do not know Aramaic, and thus when we speak Aramaic in our prayers, we have a direct line to God, and we don't need to persuade the angels to work in our favor. Now, that is an argument that, it's mentioned in the Talmud, right? Yet, one would claim that the real reason why some of the prayers were written in Aramaic is because that's the language people knew. Okay? Because the Talmud was composed in the time of in the time that many Jews throughout the world, their primary language was Aramaic. That's why many of the prayers composed during those times are in fact in Aramaic. Hence, the consequences are quite striking, because if the reason for using Aramaic in liturgy was in fact to trick the angels, then that reason did not change at all. Yet, if the reason some prayers were composed in Aramaic was only because that was the language of the people at the time, well, nowadays, people speak German, people speak Hungarian. Maybe it is time to use these languages in our prayers and in our synagogues. Now, I must say that historically speaking, we know for a fact that throughout history, many congregations and many Jews prayed in various languages. How do we know that? It's very simple. Because the Talmud says that one can pray in every language whatsoever. So, for example, rabbis from the Neolog section would say, well, if the Talmud says it's okay, and if we have historical precedents to the fact that one can pray in a foreign language, well, why won't we do so nowadays? Now, some would say, well, because that was in different times, in different generations. They were great Talmidei Chachamim, they were great scholars. We are not as great a scholar as they are. Rabbi Chorir would say that's an excuse, but it's not a reason, because we need to have a relevant Torah. We need our Torah to be vivid and to be concrete, but also to be something that people can connect to. And it cannot be infused by these fossils that don't make any sense when we come to discuss major questions of our daily behavior. We need to have better reasoning, and we need to use our common sense when we discuss halachic questions. Now, needless to say that many rabbis did not think highly of these ideas. However, the common people throughout Hungary really like this. Now, the Hungarian population, the Jewish Hungarian population, was very different than its parallel Jewish community in Germany. That is, within Hungarian circles, all of the Jews, or almost all of the Jews in the beginning of the 19th century, were observant. There was virtually almost no assimilation whatsoever. And there was also no emancipation. That is, for Jews to be part of the government, to go to university, and to have a modern lifestyle wasn't that common. And Jews were not only not assimilated, but they were also, I'm not sure how you say it, they were not accultured. Yeah, I think that's a word, right? Accultured. They were not assimilated culturally in their Hungarian background, in their Hungarian native areas. They were always considered as a minority, but a very closed minority and very strict. So, whereas in Germany, the reform movement was in fact moderate in its interpretation of being a Jew in modern times, because in Germany you had 40, 50, 60% of the Jews were assimilating. Not only were they not reformed, they were already assimilating. So if you look at the whole prism of German Jewry, it would be safe to say that the reform movement would actually be in the middle. They will hold middle ground, because on the one hand, you had the strict observant Jews, and on the other hand, you had Jews who already forgot they were Jewish 2 generations ago. So the reform movement could be considered as more, now this is a tricky word, so I won't use it that often, conservative, but I'm talking conservative not in the Jewish affiliations nowadays, but as literally, they were more conservative than, of course, those Jews who assimilated. Whereas in Hungary, since we did not have any assimilation in Hungary, since Jews were not part of the general Hungarian society in the beginning of the 19th century, for them, to have someone with ideas like Rabbi Aaron Chorin and his friends, that was considered heresy. That was considered being on the tip of those who are in fact almost abandoning their Jewish roots, despite the fact that were it up to Rabbi Chorin, I doubt he would find himself, and I doubt he would feel pleasant and at home in a Reform convention of rabbis in Germany. I believe that he would feel completely out of place, because if we see how he speaks and how he writes about halakha, he has nothing to do with the Reform movement. And now, perhaps this is the most basic difference between the Reform and the Neolog. And of course, I haven't even discussed major Neolog leaders. The Neolog movement is a strictly halachic movement. They believe in the halakha. They adhere to halakha, at least in the public sphere. Okay, I'll speak about that in a moment, but at least in the public sphere, they are halachic Jews. In their synagogues, by the way, they are called synagogues and not temples, as opposed to the Reform movement. In their synagogues, the prayers are identical to those that are recited in Orthodox synagogues. The setting in the Neolog synagogues is almost identical to that of classical Orthodox synagogue. That's not exactly correct. I will refrain from that assertion in a moment, but just stay with me for a moment. If you would visit a Neolog synagogue as opposed to an Orthodox synagogue, it would take you some time. If you're not an expert in the field, it would take you some time to get the difference, okay? Because they really do look very close to one another. The prayers in Neolog synagogues are in Hebrew. They use the same siddur, the same liturgy book as used in all other Orthodox synagogues. The rabbis will not neglect the Shabbat laws. The rabbis will not eat non-kosher. Almost every Neolog community had mikveh and had Jewish slaughtering according to Jewish law, as opposed to, this is a dramatic difference, as opposed to Reform congregations. Just be with me for a moment and I'll show you the differences. It's very easy to trace them. For example, just a moment. Okay, here, let's look at this, for example. Okay, here, be with me. This is a prayer in a Reform synagogue nowadays, but it's not very different than the German standard, I would say. It is a bit different. I'll explain later, just a moment.
Page 46, 48, and 50. Please rise as able.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, El Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Koneh Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot V'Imahot, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה.
Page 50.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם. מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, צומח נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים.
Okay, just a moment. I want to just what did we see here? First of all, they used tools. Okay, they used a guitar. They also used a mic. Did you see it? Yeah. Now, we had a woman leading the prayer. The blessings themselves are completely new. They have nothing, or not nothing, but they are very different than the classical prayers as they were formulated in the Talmud. They changed the phrasing of the avot, and they added avot and imahot, that is not only fathers, but also mothers, a very feminist perspective. They, Elokei Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah, they added Sarah and Rachel and Leah, of course. But, and here's where we come back to the text, because this is very, very important. What they did here, it's not evident at first glance, only if you look at the brackets, Mechaye Akol as opposed to Mechaye Meitim, okay? In the classical text, it says Mechaye Meitim Berachamim Rabbi. What you see here is a big drama, because this is a debate regarding the actual reincarnation of dead. One of Maimonides' 13 foundations of the Jewish ideology is the idea that God will indeed revive the dead. But you see here, this is not only a feminist question of egalitarian or something like that. This is, in fact, an ideological debate. And you see here that the leading voice within the Reform community here is to, in fact, say or to omit from the prayer the fact that God will revive the dead. Because instead of saying Mechaye Meitim, that is reviver of the dead, what they say is giving life to all, which is a generic claim that everything alive is from God. But it's a generic claim as opposed to a redemptive claim. So here you see a liberal, and I'm not talking liberal here politically speaking, this is a liberal attitude toward the liturgy. That is, they feel, within the Reform community, they feel that it is not only their right and autonomy to make changes, but they actually feel it's essential for them to make changes in the core of the Jewish prayer. Why is it essential? Because they have to have prayers that are relevant and that reflect the ideological worldview of the worshipers. So they have a lot of freedom when it comes to how they construct the prayers and how they construct their ideological way of life. Now, what you didn't see there, but I can tell you, is that they lighted the candles in the synagogue during the Shabbat. which of course is completely forbidden if one is in a Shabbat observant Jew. But within the Reform circle, there's no problem with that, not at all, because the lighting of the Shabbat candles is a folkloristic act and not a religious halachic act. It is a religious act, but it is more of a folklore, a tradition, rather than a halachic obligation. Okay, now this is very important. For example, but yeah, just one someone asked here. Oh, no problem. But let me compare this to for example, the Dohan Yeutza. The Dohan Yeutza, which is the biggest neolog synagogue in the world, symbolic Shabbat service at Dohan Yeutza. This is not filmed in Shabbat. That's why it's symbolic. It's not filmed in Shabbat.
ניאו EL6, 0 קילומטרים, החל מ-269,000 שקלים, וטריידין במחיר מחירון.
Halachic movement. They sing a tikva, by the way. This doesn't look like this. This is a chief rabbi, by the way. He looks like a rabbi, like a rabbi in ancient history. I mean, just don't. I want to show you. Oh, here. Let's see the Rumbach synagogue. Okay, Rumbach synagogue is also a great synagogue in oh, that's not there. Sorry. Here you can see that the women sit above. They don't sit with the men, as opposed to nowadays Reform congregations. You see the cantor. You won't see here woman with talit. They aren't part of the religious leadership as rabbis or cantors. That's not. So the differences are quite striking. First of all, just a moment. Still up to date, you do not have women as rabbis in neolog communities, whereas in even conservative communities, it's a given throughout the world, and of course, in North America, that it became common in North America in the conservative movement only in the 90s, in the Reform movement, I think in the 60s, but the Neolog movement up to this day do not have women as rabbinic leaders and women as cantors. Never. Even the organ, which will be part of many non-Orthodox synagogues. By the way, they are called synagogues and not temples, and this is also a very big difference. The organ will not be an integral part, architectural part of the synagogue. It would be hidden, and there would be a barrier between the synagogue and the organ, and in most cases, those who will play the organ will be non-Jews. And using this barrier and using the help of a non-Jew to pray and to use the tools, the instruments, actually makes a very problematic halachic questions very simple and not problematic. So this is halachic reasoning behind how the Neolog Jews perceive their own identity and how they actually build their synagogues. This is the complete opposite of what you see in Reformed synagogues and what you saw in Reformed synagogues, temples, I'm sorry, even before the Second World War. Historically speaking, this is a very different movement. Now, as I showed you, it's different from the outset. It's not only different today, it was different 180 years ago because the basic foundations of the Reform movement were non-halachic, or even, I dare say, anti-halachic. Whereas the Neolog movement was always a halachic movement. Yet still, despite the fact that the Neolog movement was much more halachic than its Neolog counterpart, the fact is that the Neolog movement was considered by the Orthodox counterparts in Hungary as a completely devastating movement that aims to ruin Jewry in its entirety. Whereas in Germany, it was very, very different. And this is where we need to understand why the Hungarian story became much more violent and much more feisty, as I said, and really the rhetoric was horrific within the Hungarian community. First of all, essentially, when my foe doesn't look like me and doesn't behave like me, and the difference between us is very clear, then I don't need to alienate myself and to distance myself at the same with the same energy. The problem becomes much more critical when my foe actually looks like my friend. That is, if you go to a Neolog synagogue and an Orthodox synagogue, for a Gentile, for a non-Jew, to go into the synagogue, it will take them a lot of time to actually find any differences. Whereas going to a temple, a Reformed temple, and an Orthodox synagogue, they look completely different. They behave completely different. You can understand you're in a different establishment after 2 minutes. That's why the tension between these two movements was much more greater because they had to distance themselves. Moreover, politics and money. A lot of politics and a lot of money. The Hungarian model of the community was very different than the German model of a community. And we'll speak about Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, not today, but in future lessons. But this is a very important idea that we must understand. In the 1860s, in Hungary, due to an attempt by the government to actually help the Jewish communities, but they wanted the funding that comes from the government to the Jewish communities, they wanted it to be much more strict and governed in better terms. Now, the idea was, let's tell the Jews to hold a conference of all of the Jewish communities in Hungary. And once they have this conference, let them, the Jewish communities in Hungary, take autonomy and explain to us, the government, their needs. Let them establish a higher hierarchy of communities that will actually help us, the government, fund and help and aid all of the different congregations. Now, what began as a nice initiative by the government quickly became a battlefield between more strict observant communities and lesser strict and observant communities and leaders. Now, due to various trends that occurred in Hungary at the time, when they came to the Congress, what they actually found out was that the neologues have a majority. Now, having a majority in this political, financial institution was very critical, because what it meant was that they will decide about kashrut, they will decide about Jewish education, they will decide about the mikvaot, the mikvah, whereas the Orthodox leaders, who were a minority, found themselves suddenly not only as a minority when it comes to numbers, nominal minority, but they actually found themselves without any power to raise their children, to run their congregations and communities, to get kosher meat according to their understanding, and to have a mikvah with some funding from the government that will help them keep the laws of purity. Because the Neolog Jews, who were the majority, suddenly became those responsible for the money. Now, this was a major crisis, and it took more than a year to settle it. And the way it was settled was that the Orthodox communities became autonomous from the Jewish communities. The Gemeinde, the community, got split, and it got split throughout Hungary. From that time, from 1868-69, up until the Second World War, the Jewish community in Hungary was split in the beginning into two different factions, and shortly thereafter, a third faction came to be, which was the status quo, but let's not go into that because it won't end. What actually happened was that now you had different communities, and you had to tell the government, each and every Jew had to tell the government to identify themselves either as an Orthodox or as a Neolog. Now, the Neologs got money, the Orthodox got money. They got money per capita. Of course, the Neolog got more money, and they were much more powerful because they had better positions, politically speaking and financially speaking, and so on and so forth. But what happened was that you had completely different communities, and you had different institutions. Almost every town in Hungary had an Orthodox rabbi and a Neolog rabbi, an Orthodox mikveh and a Neolog mikveh, an Orthodox shoichet, a slaughterer, and a Neolog shoichet. Now, and schools, everything was split. Now, once you get split into really atomic sizes, because sometimes the community barely had a minyan, barely had the possibility to hold a functioning synagogue. But once you go to that point, that you can never come back, okay? Because the hatred, the rhetoric, the schism becomes so profound and so pronounced, and it's everywhere. Every Jewish street in Hungary was split. Families belonged to different sections. And of course, once that happened, Orthodox Jews married Orthodox Jews. Neolog Jews married Neolog Jews. Orthodox Jews did not attend Neolog synagogues, and vice versa. And it's very easy. It's a slippery slope very easy to go from there to a complete schism and an all-out war. Now, in Germany, ironically, the communities never split. That is, except for the Hirsch sect in Frankfurt and in several minor places in Germany, the Orthodox synagogues and the Reformed temples were part of the same Gemeinde. I'm sorry, that is, they were part of the same financial organization. The Jews of Frankfurt, both the Reformed Jews of Frankfurt and the Orthodox Jews of Frankfurt, got their money from paid their money to and their fees, their congregational fees to the same institution, and they got their funding to their synagogues, to their rabbis, to their schools. They all got it from the same place. So you had a lot of you had a lot of relationships between Orthodox and Reformed Jews. In most of the places, there wasn't hatred. There was actually cooperation. Now, of course, they were different. They were different. And most Orthodox Jews did not attend Reformed synagogues or Reformed temples and vice versa. But the Reform movement, generally speaking, did not use, at least not in those amounts, did not use a slaughterer, because Reformed Jews did not have Jewish slaughtering. And mikvah, in most places, they did not have a functioning mikvah. So if a Reformed Jew wanted to use a mikvah or wanted to have kosher meat, they could just go to the Orthodox meat shop or to the Orthodox mikvah and use it. It came from the same money. So the congregations, the Gemeinde, was one. And since it was one, you had a lot of relationships between these different congregations and these different movements. Now, I will go into much deeper elaboration next time. That's enough for today. And next time we will look in more depth into the rhetoric of what happened actually in Hungary and how things ended up so traumatically and so tragically, one would say. Any questions? Great. So I wish you all a pleasant evening, and we'll meet again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.